It was just an old teacup. But when Miss Edith picked it up, the folded scrap of paper hidden beneath became the key to a secret that had waited years to surface. A message born from a buried betrayal. One hidden behind a gentleman's smile and polished lies. And now that secret had come alive again. The sun was beginning its slow descent, casting a soft amber glow over St. Mary Me. The village lay nestled in a gentle hush, its quaint thatched cottages and rose-lined lanes basking in the peaceful embrace of a perfect English summer afternoon. The annual garden fete at the vicarage, a beloved tradition woven into the fabric of the village's history, was in full swing. Laughter and the clinking of china rose above the warm hum of polite conversation, as villagers in their Sunday best mingled under the large, fluttering white canopy of the tea tent. Mrs. Beatrice Elwood, the vicar's wife, presided with a sharp eye and a sharper tongue, ensuring each teacup was filled to the brim. Near the edge of the tent, Miss Jane Marple sat, her small frail figure blending into the crowd unnoticed by most. Her knitting needles clicked rhythmically, a soft counterpoint to the bustle around her, her lavender cardigan nearly invisible in the vibrant atmosphere. To the casual observer, she was just another elderly spinster, quietly enjoying the simple pleasures of a summer afternoon. But those who truly knew her understood that behind her serene smile, her pale blue eyes missed nothing. It was when the fete reached its peak, with villagers fully immersed in the cheerful chaos, that the first ripple of unease sliced through the harmony. A shrill scream, sharp and sudden, cut through the murmur of voices, freezing the air, causing teacups to pause mid-sip. A collective shiver passed through the crowd as all eyes turned toward the rose garden, the secluded corner of the vicarage, where prized blooms stood in quiet splendor. Miss Marple set her knitting aside, her fingers pausing mid-motion as she tilted her head slightly, listening. Moments later, young Tommy Pierce, the baker's boy, appeared, his face pale and his cap askew, stumbling into the scene. "It's Mr. Hargreaves," he gasped, his voice cracking. He's dead." A gasp rippled through the crowd. Mrs. Elwood dropped the teapot she had been holding, the porcelain shattering in a silent explosion against the grass. Clement, the vicar, hurried toward the garden, his cassock billowing in his wake as the villagers surged forward, curiosity overcoming their decorum. But Miss Marple remained seated, her gaze shifting from one face to the next, noting the subtle tensions around her. Mrs. Lucy Dane, the postmistress, gripped her handbag a little too tightly, her knuckles white, while Colonel Bantry's jovial demeanor faltered for the briefest moment as he muttered something to his wife. Small things perhaps, but Miss Marple had learned long ago that in these small details lay the heart of the mystery. When the police arrived, led by Inspector Clark, a brisk, efficient young man, the scene was already cordoned off. Reginald Hargreaves, the retired solicitor, who had only moved to the village 6 months prior, lay sprawled in the rose garden, his face frozen in an expression of stunned surprise. A teacup, chipped at the rim, rested beside him, its dark ominous contents staining the earth. A faint scent of almonds hung in the air, sharp and bitter. Miss Marple, her sharp gaze lingering on the cup, felt an unsettling familiarity. She overheard Dr. Haydock, the village physician, murmuring to the inspector. "Poison, most likely," he said, his voice low. "Cyanide. If I had to guess. Quick. Brutal." The crowd buzzed with speculation. Who would want to kill old Hargreaves? Someone asked. Kept to himself, didn't he? Another voice joined in. Always thought he was a bit off. Those late-night walks of his. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her face betraying no emotion. But her mind was already at work, turning over the pieces of the puzzle. As the fete dissolved into a chaotic frenzy, Inspector Clark began questioning the villagers, his voice authoritative, his pen moving quickly across the notepad. Miss Marple watched him closely as he moved from person to person, noting the way Mrs. Elwood wrung her hands nervously, insisting she'd served Mr. Hargreaves his tea just as he liked it, and how Tommy Pierce fumbled with his words, barely coherent. The inspector's notebook filled swiftly, but Miss Marple suspected that the answers he sought wouldn't be so easily uncovered. With deliberate slowness, she rose from her seat, tucking her knitting away in her bag. Her gaze lingered on the teacup by Mr. Hargreaves' side, the chipped rim still haunting her thoughts. An odd detail, one that tugged at a memory just out of reach. As she passed Mrs. Dane, the postmistress shot her a quick, nervous glance before hurriedly turning her attention elsewhere. Miss Marple knew that, in the quiet of this peaceful village, secrets were always lurking just beneath the surface, and she would find them. The sun sank lower, casting long twisted shadows across St. Mary Me, where the village, once bustling with laughter and the clink of teacups, now stood eerily still in the fading light. The air itself seemed to thicken with an unspoken tension, the kind of silence that spoke volumes. As the last stragglers of the fete reluctantly returned to their homes, whispers began to stir like a rising wind, growing louder as nightfall crept over the village. Jane Marple sat in the cozy corner of her cottage, a cup of tea growing cold on the sill, her knitting idle in her hands as she watched the world unfold. From her vantage point on the high street, she could see the police car roll up to the vicarage, its presence stirring the air like a harbinger of secrets that would soon be laid bare. The inspector, young and brisk, wasted no time. His movements were purposeful, and already small groups of villagers gathered, speaking in hushed tones, their voices carrying the weight of suspicion. Miss Marple knew better than most that gossip was often the most reliable detective in a small village, provided one had the patience to sift through it for the smallest of truths. At the village shop, the air buzzed with the kind of excitement that only tragedy could bring. Mrs. Lucy Dane, the postmistress, stood proudly behind the counter, relishing her role as the bearer of news. Poisoned right there in the rose garden, she announced, her eyes gleaming with the satisfaction of knowing something others did not. Cyanide, Dr. Haydock said. I smelled it myself. Bitter almonds like death. The townsfolk hung on her every word, nodding solemnly, even as Mrs. Price, the butcher's wife, clucked her tongue with disdain. Never liked Hargreaves, she muttered, her cheeks flushed with indignation. Always skulking around he was. My Albert saw him, late at night by the woods, lantern in hand. No good, if you ask me. The gossip swirled like a storm, each person adding their own speculation to the mix, until it was almost impossible to tell where truth ended and conjecture began. Across the room, Colonel Bantry let out a sharp snort, clearly unimpressed by the whole affair. Nonsense, he declared, though his voice lacked conviction. He was just a solicitor, not some villain from a penny dreadful. But I wouldn't be surprised if someone had done him in. He did have that look about him, didn't he? Mrs. Bantry, tugging at her husband's sleeve, shot him a nervous glance. Arthur, don't start that nonsense, she whispered. You'll have the whole village thinking he was some sort of spy or criminal. Miss Marple stood nearby, her quiet presence almost unnoticed as she sifted through the pieces of the conversation, observing the subtle shifts in posture and tone that spoke volumes. Mrs. Dane's nervous habit of clutching the counter tightly, Mrs. Price's flicker of unease before she spoke, and Colonel Bantry's uncharacteristic boldness, all these small details were not lost on her. She took it all in, knowing that in this village the smallest hints could unravel the darkest of truths. By midday, the web of rumors had grown only more tangled. Tommy Pierce, recovering from the shock, delivered his daily roles with the same wide-eyed expression, repeating with conviction that he'd seen Hargreaves arguing with Mrs. Elwood just before the fateful event. Something about the tea, he muttered, as if the mere mention of the word sent chills down his spine. Meanwhile, old Mr. Pye, the gardener, had his own dark tale to tell. He'd seen a shadowy figure, draped in black, near the vicarage the night before. Like a ghost, he grumbled, his words laced with foreboding. The vicar, Mr. Clement, tried to assure the villagers it was all an accident, though his voice was thin with doubt, and no one seemed to believe him. As for Mrs. Elwood, she had taken to her bed, claiming a headache, but the village couldn't help but wonder whether guilt or grief had laid her low. Miss Marple, ever the patient observer, returned to her quiet retreat, where the soft chiming of the church bells marked the passing of another hour. She had heard enough to know the truth was far more elusive than the villagers could fathom. The pieces of the puzzle were scattered, but as always, she would wait. After all, in a village like St. Mary Me, The most intriguing mysteries were often hidden in plain sight, waiting for the right set of eyes to unravel them. The morning after the grim discovery, the village of St. Mary Me was unusually still, as though it held its breath, waiting for something or someone to reveal the truth. The whispers had intensified, thickening the air like a fog. Miss Jane Marple sat quietly in her cozy sitting room, the rhythmic click of her knitting needles filling the silence, her mind more attuned to the village's subtle undercurrents than the busy chatter outside. The investigation into Mr. Hargreaves' death was now the heart of the village's every conversation. Yet Miss Marple, with the quiet wisdom of a lifetime's observations, remained aloof from the frenzy. The inspector's presence at the vicarage had done little to calm the rising suspicions, and despite his efforts, the village seemed to be spiraling deeper into uncertainty. Yet she knew that the truth would not stay hidden long. It rarely did, especially not here. As the morning unfolded, Dolly Bantry arrived, breathless and flushed, her eyes wide with concern. She had come not just to share the latest details, but to confide in Jane. "The inspector, Jane. He's been grilling poor Beatrice Elwood all morning, asking if she knew anything about the poison," Dolly confessed, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "And those awful questions about the old service revolver. Arthur would never." Miss Marple's eyes flickered with interest, but her face remained unreadable, calm. The chipped teacup, so insignificant to most, was still haunting her thoughts. Beatrice had always been particular about it, that old porcelain cup with the faded roses. But why had Mr. Hargreaves insisted on using it, despite the obvious damage? Dolly, in her usual flurry, rambled on about the cyanide, Dr. Haddock's certainty. But Miss Marple's thoughts lingered on the details. Too many contradictions. Too many half-formed truths. Cyanide wasn't something one casually acquired, especially not in a village like St. Mary Me. The quiet hum of the village, filled with hushed voices and speculative glances, only deepened the mystery. Miss Marple could feel the threads of the case coming together, but they were tangled, elusive, like the knots in her knitting. No one had noticed the small clues she had, like how Beatrice's hands had trembled when she spoke about the teacup, or how Dolly's usually firm opinions now wavered under the slightest pressure. These were the moments that told the real story. As she resumed her knitting, Miss Marple felt a small thrill of satisfaction. The truth, as always, was waiting, buried beneath layers of misdirection and fear. The village might think they knew the answer, but Miss Marple knew better. The killer was here, hidden in plain sight, and only the careful sifting of truth from rumor would expose them. The morning air felt sharp with tension, as the village of St. Mary Me slowly returned to its usual rhythm, though the dark shadow of Mr. Hargreaves' death loomed heavily over the small community. Miss Jane Marple, however, was unperturbed, seated comfortably by the hearth in her quiet sitting room, the steady clicking of her knitting needles, a soothing contrast to the chaos that churned just outside her door. Dolly Bantry, looking flustered and frazzled, had arrived that morning, with a new batch of gossip, her voice lowered conspiratorially, as she recounted the latest tidbits of the investigation. "Lucy Dane was positively twitchy, Jane," Dolly murmured, her eyes wide with the thrill of the unknown. "She fidgeted with her handbag the whole time the inspector was questioning her. And Tommy Pierce swears he saw Beatrice and Hargreaves having a heated argument just before it all happened. What do you make of that?" Miss Marple paused for a moment, her needles stilling in her hands as she pondered the details. "People do tend to get nervous when under scrutiny," she replied calmly, her voice a picture of serenity. "Arguments are hardly unusual, even among friends." Dolly, clearly dissatisfied with such a measured response, pressed on, recounting every last detail she had overheard at the vicarage. Miss Marple listened attentively, her mind piecing together the puzzle with the same care she took in knitting her delicate patterns. The teacup, the one with the chipped rim, kept drifting back into her thoughts. Hargreaves had been insistent on it, yet Dolly had dismissed it as a mere eccentricity. But to Miss Marple, such a small detail was rarely insignificant. Later that afternoon, As she strolled along the high street, Miss Marple paused near the vicarage gate, observing the activity around it with mild interest. The inspector, a man of method and certainty, had been busy all morning, his constables bustling about like bees in a hive, but it was clear that he was growing frustrated with the lack of progress. As he noticed her, he nodded briefly, his tone respectful, yet tinged with the exasperation he often felt when it came to Miss Marple's subtle interventions. "Good afternoon, Miss Marple," he said, his eyes scanning the street. "I assume you're keeping a watchful eye on us." Miss Marple smiled faintly, her expression one of quiet amusement. "Oh, hardly," she replied with a soft laugh. "I'm simply enjoying the fresh air." The inspector's gaze shifted, his eyes narrowing slightly as he mentioned cyanide, the fatal poison that had been slipped into Hargreaves' tea. "No doubt it was done during the fete," he said, flipping through his notebook. "Half the village was milling about, so it could have been anyone." "Anyone indeed," Miss Marple murmured, her thoughts already drifting back to the teacup, the one they found beside him. The inspector seemed momentarily caught off guard. "A chipped teacup," he scoffed. "It's just a teacup." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled with a quiet knowing. "But Mr. Hargreaves seemed particularly attached to it, didn't he? He always said it reminded him of home." "Strange for a man who had only lived here 6 months. Don't you think?" The inspector frowned but noted it down nonetheless. "Curious, perhaps. But we've got bigger fish to fry. We're looking into his past. Seems he left London under a bit of a cloud. Could be an old grudge followed him here." Miss Marple nodded, her expression unchanged, though her mind was already at work, turning over the new information. The past, she knew, was never truly gone. It lingered like a shadow that never quite left. And in a village like St. Mary Mee, it was always bound to resurface. As she continued her walk, her thoughts remained sharp, the pieces of the puzzle slowly but surely falling into place. The cyanide, the teacup, the argument, each was a thread, delicate yet important, weaving its way through the fabric of the investigation. Miss Marple was certain now. The truth was close, hiding in plain sight, and she would find it. All it would take was a little patience and a watchful eye. The village might be caught up in its own theories, but Miss Marple knew better. The truth, as always, was quieter than the noise. It whispered, it waited, and soon it would be hers to uncover. The late afternoon sun stretched lazily across the village of St. Mary Mead, bathing the quaint cottages and lush gardens in a warm golden glow that seemed to lull the village into a false sense of calm. Yet, beneath this serene exterior, something far more unsettling was beginning to unfurl. Miss Jane Marple sat in her favorite corner of the garden, the one where the roses bloomed in a riot of colors, the scent thick in the air. The steady click of her knitting needles, a rhythmic sound that usually brought her a sense of peace, was now a mere backdrop to the puzzle that had begun to take shape in her mind. The village, normally a quiet haven, had been buzzing with whispers ever since the tragic death of Hargreaves, the village's beloved but mysterious handyman. Miss Marple, ever observant, and rarely caught off guard, knew it was only a matter of time before someone would come to her with the latest gossip, a thread she could tug at to unravel the truth. Her patience was soon rewarded, as the garden gate creaked open, and Mrs. Price, the butcher's wife, stormed in. She had a determined air about her, a mix of triumph and indignation, and as she plopped down onto the bench opposite Miss Marple, her face was flushed with the excitement of having news to share. "They're all but sure it was her, Miss Marple," Mrs. Price announced, her voice a mixture of satisfaction and disbelief. "Mrs. Elwood, I mean. The inspector's been questioning her at the vicarage all morning. He's got the poor woman under a microscope, and I hear Tommy Pierce saw her arguing with Hargreaves, just before he keeled over the tea of all things." Miss Marple didn't react immediately, her needles still clicking away with a calm, steady rhythm. Her eyes narrowed slightly, though, as she considered the information. "An argument, you say? Over the tea?" she asked, her voice soft, almost disinterested. Mrs. Price nodded vigorously, her face lighting up as she spoke. Oh yes, it was a proper row. Tommy says Hargreaves was yelling at her for being slow. Something about her taking her time with the tea. And she snapped right back at him. Said something nasty about him being an ungrateful wretch. And then, well, next thing you know, he's dead. Right there, in front of everyone. It's the talk of the village. Miss Marple's knitting slowed, but she didn't stop. Her mind was already working through the details, searching for inconsistencies, for something that didn't fit. Yes, it does seem rather convenient, doesn't it? She said softly, her eyes distant as if lost in thought. But people do argue over the most trivial things, don't they? Especially when the pressures of daily life get the better of them. Mrs. Price looked at her in disbelief. But Miss Marple, that's not all. Tommy says the inspector found something in Mrs. Elwood's shed. Rat poison. Hiding behind a stack of old tools. And who has the key to that shed? Mrs. Elwood herself, of course. She's in and out of there all day, and no one thinks to question it. The poison must have been there for ages, just waiting for the right moment. Miss Marple paused, her needles resting gently in her lap. Her gaze drifted out the window, but her thoughts were anything but distant. Yes, the shed, she murmured, her voice thoughtful. That's quite a find, isn't it? It does seem rather convenient. But still something feels off. Why would Mrs. Elwood, of all people, take such a drastic step? She's always been a proud, efficient woman. A minor dispute over the tea seems so trivial. Mrs. Price leaned in, eager to press her case. But Miss Marple, she had the motive, and the opportunity, and the poison right there in her shed. It all adds up, doesn't it? She's the only one with the key, and she was in and out of the shed all afternoon. No one thinking twice about it. And then right after the row with Hargreaves. He's dead. Miss Marple sipped her tea slowly, her mind racing. Yes, it does look bad for her, I suppose, she said quietly, though her voice held no conviction. She paused, her eyes glinting with a hint of curiosity, as she looked back at Mrs. Price. But what about the tea itself? Hargreaves was such a particular man, wasn't he? Always asking for that chipped cup. And yet he never seemed the type to create such a scene over something so small. It strikes me as odd. Mrs. Price frowned, momentarily thrown by Miss Marple's line of questioning. Well, yes, but people do argue over silly things, don't they? And with the poison right there in the shed. Quite. Miss Marple interrupted gently, her tone making it clear that she hadn't forgotten the poison. The inspector will no doubt be very thorough in his investigation. He's a methodical man. I expect he'll have it all sorted soon. But as Mrs. Price continued to chatter, Miss Marple's mind wandered, her gaze shifting back to the vicarage in the distance. The poison in the shed, Mrs. Elwood's access to it, the argument over the tea, everything pointed in her direction. And yet, Miss Marple's instincts told her that the truth wasn't quite so simple. No, something about this case didn't sit right with her. And the more she thought about it, the more certain she became that there was another piece to this puzzle. The question was, what was it? Mrs. Elwood's proximity to the crime scene, her volatile temper, it all made her an easy target. But Miss Marple had learned long ago not to trust the easy answers. No, the truth was lurking somewhere, just beneath the surface. And Miss Marple, with her quiet patience and sharp mind, would find it. The late afternoon light cast long shadows over the village of St. Mary Mead, the golden glow of the setting sun making the quaint stone cottages and lush gardens appear almost too perfect, as though hiding a darker undercurrent. But Jane Marple, always alert, knew better. Her quiet, observant nature had long taught her that the calmest places often harbored the deepest secrets. And today, the tension in the air was palpable. The sudden mysterious death of Hargreaves, the handyman everyone relied on, had unsettled the village, and it was a matter of time before the truth was uncovered, though she suspected it would not be as straightforward as it seemed. Inspector Craddock, young and eager to make a name for himself, was quick to latch on to Mrs. Elwood as the prime suspect. thanks to a few bits of circumstantial evidence. Yet something about the case seemed off. Jane Marple, as always, trusted her instincts. Mrs. Elwood, the vicar's wife, had indeed been seen arguing with Hargreaves. But the details didn't add up. There was more to the story. She felt certain of it. Miss Marple took a slow walk past the vicarage, her shawl drawn tightly around her as the evening chill began to creep in. The rose garden, once a symbol of peace, was now cordoned off, a constable stationed by the gate. But Miss Marple's eyes were drawn to the shed beyond, its weathered door ajar, a flicker of movement catching her attention. A quick, almost imperceptible figure darted by the vicarage wall. Lucy Dane, her handbag clutched tightly to her chest, eyes darting nervously. Was it coincidence that she was skulking about the very scene of the crime? Perhaps. But Miss Marple never trusted coincidences. Back in her cozy cottage, Miss Marple settled into her chair by the fire, the flickering flames casting dancing shadows across the room. She tried to focus on her knitting, but the threads of the case tangled in her mind. The evidence against Mrs. Elwood, the argument, the poison, the access to the shed was compelling. But something still gnawed at her. The chipped teacup, the argument, the rat poison, the odd behavior of Mrs. Dane. All of it didn't quite align, like a jigsaw puzzle with one piece missing. Could the real truth be hiding just beneath the surface, waiting for the right person to notice it? As the days passed, the village buzzed with gossip, and the villagers' certainty that Mrs. Elwood was guilty grew stronger. Inspector Craddock was closing in, focusing entirely on her, leaving little room for anyone else in his investigation. But Jane Marple's mind refused to rest. One particular detail from that fateful day kept tugging at her, a detail no one else had thought to mention. Hargreaves' teacup had been found, its contents staining the ground beneath him. But no one had mentioned a matching saucer. She remembered distinctly how Mrs. Elwood had handed Hargreaves the cup on a rose-patterned saucer, as he had always insisted on his preferred set. So why had the saucer vanished from the story? Had it been left behind in the tea tent? Or was it hidden elsewhere? The saucer itself was of little consequence to anyone but Hargreaves, yet its absence felt like a small, overlooked clue. She moved to the window, her gaze scanning the village street through the misty drizzle. The saucer was trivial in the grand scheme of things, a mere piece of chipped china, but its disappearance nagged at her. Was it taken on purpose, or was it left behind accidentally? Either way, it was a detail no one had noticed, and in Miss Marple's experience, the smallest details often held the key to unlocking the truth. She resumed her knitting, her fingers moving expertly, but her mind was far from the rhythm of the needles. The truth, she was sure, was still hiding in plain sight, and as she waited, she felt a growing certainty that soon, very soon, the pieces would fall into place. The drizzle that had blanketed the village of St. Mary Me, creating a mist that clung to the cobblestones, and muted the bustle of everyday life, did little to dull Miss Marple's sharp mind. She had listened carefully to every word exchanged, every detail that had seemed trivial to others, because she knew in her bones it was always the smallest things that held the key to unraveling the larger mystery. The more she thought about it, the more her mind lingered on one peculiar detail. The absence of the saucer, the teacup, the one Hargreaves had used, had been found in the rose garden, its contents staining the earth beneath, but no one had mentioned the saucer, and that omission ate at her. Why had no one noticed it was missing? She recalled the day at the tea tent. Mrs. Elwood had handed Hargreaves the cup, carefully setting it on its matching saucer. Yet when the scene had been pieced together, there had been no mention of the saucer's fate. Was it left behind in the tent, discarded carelessly, or had it vanished entirely, just like the poison had seemed to materialize out of thin air? It was a simple thing, a saucer, but Miss Marple's mind was trained to see beyond the surface. Just then, Tommy Pierce arrived, wet and uncomfortable, with sausages from Mrs. Price, a kind gesture in the midst of the brewing storm. Tommy was a boy of few words, but his silence, coupled with his nervous movements, was enough to spark a chain of thought in Miss Marple's mind. He had witnessed the argument between Hargreaves and Mrs. Elwood, but it was his mention of Mrs. Dane, fidgeting near the vicarage wall, that caused a deeper shift. Tommy had noticed her, twitching with a kind of nervous energy. Why had she been so jumpy? And why had she been so close to the shed in the garden? The pieces were starting to form a puzzle, but one crucial piece was still missing: the saucer. Why had no one looked for it? Was it possible that Mrs. Dane had something to do with its disappearance, and perhaps the murder itself? As Tommy hurried off, eager to escape the rain, Miss Marple felt a deep certainty settle over her. There was more to this case than anyone realized. She had her suspect now. It wasn't Mrs. Elwood, not entirely. It was someone who had been overlooked, someone hiding in plain sight, just as the missing saucer had been. As she settled back into her chair, the rain tapping softly against the window, Miss Marple's thoughts sharpened. The inspector, blinded by his own certainties, would never see what she had seen. The truth, as always, lay in the small, seemingly insignificant details. Details that others had missed or simply ignored. It was time for Miss Marple to uncover what lay hidden in the shadows of the village. The truth veiled beneath layers of assumptions and quick judgments. The past was always present, and in this case, it was whispering the answers if only one knew where to listen. Miss Marple sat alone in her parlor, her knitting untouched beside her, her cup of Earl Grey growing cold. The village outside seemed to hum with quiet activity, but inside, her thoughts churned relentlessly. The missing saucer continued to elude her, a small detail that grew in significance with every passing moment. It wasn't just the saucer that troubled her. It was the elusive Mrs. Lucy Dane, who seemed to drift around the edges of every conversation, her nervous energy like a shadow, always present, but never fully seen. Miss Marple's keen instincts told her the postmistress was hiding something crucial. She knew this village well, knew its people, and her experience had taught her that those who kept the most guarded secrets often wore the brightest smiles. That afternoon, she donned her coat and hat, her steps deliberate as she made her way to the village shop. The bell above the door jingled as she entered, and Mrs. Dane, standing behind the counter, looked up with a tight, fleeting expression that Miss Marple caught instantly, before it melted into a polite smile. "Good afternoon, Miss Marple," she said, her voice overly bright. "What can I do for you today? Stamps perhaps? Or some of that lavender soap you like?" Miss Marple returned the smile, her eyes crinkling in that gentle way of hers, though her mind was already passing through every word. "Oh, just a few odds and ends, I think. A packet of tea perhaps. And maybe a little chat if you have a moment. It's been such a trying week, hasn't it?" Mrs. Dane's hands faltered for a brief second before she recovered, her fingers brushing against the tin of tea. "Trying? Yes," she said curtly, her tone suddenly clipped. "Poor Mr. Hargreaves. It's still hard to believe." "Nor I," Miss Marple replied, her voice soft with feigned sympathy. "He seemed such a solitary man, didn't he? I suppose you would have known him better than most, handling his post. He must have received a fair few letters from London, as he did." Mrs. Dane stiffened, her eyes flickering nervously to the counter. "Not so many," she replied quickly, almost too quickly. "Just the usual bills. A few circulars. He wasn't one for much correspondence." She busied herself with wrapping the tea in brown paper, but her movements were more meticulous than necessary, as though she were trying to hide something in plain sight. Miss Marple said nothing at first, her mind already working, noting the inconsistency. She had seen Hargreaves at the shop often enough, collecting thick, heavy envelopes in a hurry, not the kind of letters one would expect from a man with so little correspondence. "Of course," Miss Marple said smoothly, as if satisfied with the answer. "Though it's curious, isn't it? How little we know about people, even in a place like this. I wonder what brought him to St. Mary Me. Such a change from the city, don't you think?" Mrs. Dane's smile faltered for a split second, and she turned to fetch a spool of twine, her back to Miss Marple for just a moment too long. "Who can say?" she muttered, her voice strained. People move for all sorts of reasons. Indeed, Miss Marple replied, her tone unchanging. But the words were weighted with meaning. Though I dare say some reasons are harder to leave behind than others. The silence stretched, and Miss Marple could almost feel Mrs. Dane's discomfort radiating through the air. The woman's hand trembled slightly as she tied the parcel, and Miss Marple watched the subtle flicker of guilt, or was it fear, that crossed her face. It was enough to make Miss Marple pause. After paying for her tea, she thanked Mrs. Dane politely and left the shop, her mind racing. There was more to this quiet woman than met the eye, and Miss Marple was certain it had something to do with Hargreaves' death. That evening, as she sat in her cozy chair, Dolly Bantry arrived, eager to gossip, her eyes alight with new information. "Jane, you won't believe what Arthur heard at the club," she began, settling into the armchair. "It's about Hargreaves. Turns out he left London after some sort of scandal. Something to do with a client's money going missing. The police hushed it all up, but word got around. He made enemies, you see. Do you think that's why he came here to hide?" Miss Marple's knitting resumed its quiet rhythm, her mind whirling. "It's possible," she said, her voice calm. "A man with enemies might seek a quiet place to escape them. But as we both know, enemies have a way of finding a person, no matter how far they run." Dolly shivered, uneasy. "Oh, don't say that, Jane." Miss Marple's gaze was distant, focused on the puzzle she was slowly piecing together. "But it's true, Dolly. It always is." As the evening wore on, Miss Marple's thoughts grew darker, the pieces of the puzzle fitting together in ways she had not expected. Mrs. Dane, with her hidden past, her evasive manner, and her connection to Hargreaves, was now at the heart of the mystery. The postmistress knew far more than she was letting on, and Miss Marple intended to find out exactly what that was. Miss Jane Marple sat quietly in her parlor, the soft tick of the grandfather clock the only sound breaking the stillness. The cup of Earl Grey by her side had gone cold, its warm fragrance lost in the swirl of thoughts crowding her mind. Her knitting needles, usually a constant companion, lay idle in her lap, her fingers restless as they danced through the threads of her thoughts. There was something unsettling, a missing piece she couldn't quite place, and it gnawed at her with quiet insistence. The missing saucer, the inconspicuous detail that had started this chain of reflections. It seemed trivial to others, but to her it was a thread in a tapestry that had grown darker by the hour. Hargreaves' death, the cyanide poisoning, the scandal in London, and now the strange behavior of Mrs. Lucy Dane, the village postmistress, whose every glance seemed to carry a secret she was unwilling to share. There was more to Mrs. Dane than met the eye. Her nerves, her twitchy demeanor, the way she avoided certain questions. Miss Marple, with her sharp instincts honed over decades of observing human nature, couldn't shake the feeling that the postmistress was hiding something that connected her to Hargreaves' past, and perhaps to the tragedy that had unfolded in St. Mary Me. The more Miss Marple reflected on their conversation in the village shop earlier that week, the more the pieces of the puzzle began to click into place. Mrs. Dane had been too quick to dismiss the notion that Hargreaves had received letters from London, letters that may have carried more than just the usual bills. Miss Marple remembered the hurried way in which Hargreaves had collected his post from the shop, always with a sense of urgency, always alone, always in a rush to get away. A man with secrets, perhaps a man trying to escape a past that had caught up with him. The rumors had been circulating in the village, whispers of a scandal involving money and betrayal. But why had he chosen St. Mary Me to hide? What was he running from? Mrs. Dane's reluctance to speak about him, her aversion to the mention of his past, seemed to suggest that she knew more than she was willing to reveal. It was in the subtle flicker of her eyes, the way she avoided direct conversation about Hargreaves' his history. Was she merely the keeper of his correspondence, or had she been involved in something darker? Miss Marple's mind churned with possibilities. Later that evening, as the village settled into its familiar quiet rhythm, a new ripple shattered the calm. Dolly Bantry, breathless and wide-eyed, rushed to Miss Marple's door with news that sent a chill through her bones. "Jane, you won't believe it," Dolly exclaimed, almost breathless with excitement. "There's been another incident at the vicarage." "No less." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened, and she set her knitting aside, her calm demeanor never betraying the storm of thoughts stirring within her. "Another incident, you say?" she asked, her voice steady, probing. "What happened?" Dolly, wringing her hands nervously, spilled the details in a rush. "It's Mr. Clement, the vicar. He was found this morning in the rose garden, unconscious. Dr. Harduk says it's cyanide again, just like with Hargreaves. He's alive, thank heavens, but barely. They've rushed him to the hospital in much Benom." Miss Marple's mind raced as she absorbed the new twist. The same poison, cyanide. The same chilling pattern emerging once more. But there were more questions than answers. Why had Mr. Clement been targeted? Why the rose garden? Dolly continued, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and fascination. "And they found a teacup nearby, Jane. Another one from the vicarage set. Just like the one Hargreaves had. Chipped. Just like the others. And the shed. Cratix tearing it apart again. Poor Beatrice says she locked it tight after the last search, but someone must have gotten in." Miss Marple's thoughts flickered back to Mrs. Dane, to the nervous way she had handled the conversation about Hargreaves' death, her manner betraying something more than a passing concern. The poison had been taken from the shed once again, even though it had been secured. Someone had broken in. But who? And why target Mr. Clement of all people? He had been a quiet figure in the village, a man of simple habits. Had he uncovered something he shouldn't have? Miss Marple's thoughts continued to spin, pulling at the tangled threads of motive, opportunity, and suspicion. The village, which had once seemed so peaceful, was now teeming with secrets. The rising tension was palpable, and Miss Marple knew that she was standing on the edge of something much darker than anyone could have imagined. With a calmness that belied the storm in her mind, Miss Marple stood, brushing the dirt from her gloves as she looked at Dolly, who was still wringing her hands in distress. "It's beginning to make sense now," Miss Marple said softly, her eyes narrowing with determination. "First Hargreaves. Now Mr. Clement. The pieces are falling into place. But there's still much we don't know." The mystery had deepened, but Miss Marple's resolve had only grown stronger. She would unravel the threads of Mrs. Dane's secretive past, and uncover the truth about Hargreaves' life in London. What had driven him to this quiet village, and what had ultimately led to his tragic end. The puzzle was far from solved, but Miss Marple had already set her mind to one thing. She would find the answers, and the truth would come to light, no matter how deeply buried it might be. Miss Jane Marple, her mind swirling with new suspicions, remained outwardly calm as she stood by the window of her cottage, watching the village square below. The tranquility of St. Mary Mee was a fragile thing. Fragile, and now shattered by the strange turn of events that had unfolded in the past days. First Hargreaves' death, a tragedy wrapped in mystery. Then the bizarre second poisoning of the vicar, Mr. Clement, whose life had been saved, though his mind was still muddled, fogged with confusion as to how it all happened. The case had taken a strange, unexpected turn, twisting in a direction Miss Marple had only just begun to fathom. The clues were scattered, like crumbs on a trail, and each one only led to more questions. The chipped teacup that had been found near Mr. Clement's unconscious form in the rose garden had once again struck her as a troubling connection to Hargreaves' death. The same teacup, the same poison, the same cold sense of calculated cruelty. How many more times would she find these eerie repetitions before the mystery snapped open like a shell, revealing the deadly truth inside? Mrs. Lucy Dane, the village postmistress, had become a figure of increasing suspicion in Miss Marple's mind. The way she had reacted when their paths crossed earlier that day had been nothing short of telling. The brief, startled glance she had cast at Miss Marple had been too sharp, too defensive. Her demeanor, pale and unnervingly tense, had only added to the suspicion that clung to her like a shadow. 2 poisonings, both involving teacups, Miss Marple had said to her, her voice almost casual, though her words had made Mrs. Dane falter in her task. The postmistress had muttered something about not knowing who would commit such a terrible act, but Miss Marple could see the flicker of something darker in her eyes, something that spoke of guilt, or at least the fear of being caught. Mrs. Dane's hands had trembled ever so slightly as she swept the steps, and Miss Marple couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that the woman knew more than she was letting on. The fact that the lock on the shed, where the cyanide had been stored, had been forced, and the tin of poison found lighter than before, only deepened the puzzle. Someone had broken in, someone with a clear intention, someone clever enough to cover their tracks. Was Mrs. Dane involved? Or was she merely a pawn in a larger game? The thought made Miss Marple's thoughts swirl even faster. Was she truly guilty? Or was someone else framing her to keep the focus on her? The more Miss Marple considered it, the more the puzzle seemed to stretch, its pieces turning and shifting with new meaning at every turn. As the evening grew darker, Miss Marple found herself lost in contemplation. The shed, the broken lock, the missing dose of cyanide. It all painted a picture of someone who was trying to manipulate the situation, to direct suspicion away from the real culprit. And yet, the more she considered it, the more she realized that the mystery had become far more complex than anyone had imagined. Was there a deeper connection between Mr. Clement and Hargreaves? The vicar had been beloved by all, a man with no real enemies, yet someone had seen fit to poison him. Was it to throw the investigation off track, to muddy the waters enough to make the true killer's identity harder to discern? Or was there more to Mr. Clement's life, something Miss Marple had yet to uncover? She thought of Mrs. Dane again, her shaky movements and the strange, unreadable way she had spoken earlier that day. The woman had been far too evasive, her answers too vague. And then there was the matter of the missing saucer, the one that had gone missing from the teacup set during Hargreaves' death. It felt like a small detail, an insignificant thing, but in her experience, it was the smallest details that often revealed the most important truths. The threads of this mystery were growing tangled, but Miss Marple was certain of one thing. Someone was orchestrating this series of poisonings with deliberate, calculated moves, and they were closer to the heart of the village than anyone had realized. The second poisoning, the chipped teacup, the shed's broken lock, all were pieces of a puzzle Miss Marple was determined to solve. She knew the killer had made a mistake, overplaying their hand, and she intended to find the one thread that would unravel everything. As the wind howled outside her cottage, Miss Marple reached for her knitting needles once more, her mind sharp and focused, determined to see this case through to the end. The truth was waiting just beneath the surface, and she was ready to dig deeper, to peel away the layers of deception until the killer was exposed for all to see. In the dimly lit parlor of Miss Jane Marple, a pot of tea sat steaming gently beside her, its warmth filling the air. The rhythmic clicking of her knitting needles was the only sound, a steady reminder of her calm demeanor, amidst the storm of chaos unraveling in the village. 2 poisonings, one after the other, had shifted the tides of suspicion, each twist of fate pulling the threads tighter. The teacups, the cyanide, and now the forced lock of the shed. Each new detail seemed to point towards a much broader scheme, one that was deliberately designed to mislead and misdirect. Mrs. Elwood, still very much a suspect, had become an even more complex enigma. Her pale face and trembling hands only deepened the suspicion. Yet Miss Marple knew better than to jump to conclusions. That afternoon, with a basket of homemade jam under her arm as a simple pretext, Miss Marple made her way to the vicarage. She was a woman on a mission, each step purposeful, her eyes scanning every detail, every gesture. Mrs. Elwood opened the door herself, looking drained, her usual sharpness dulled by the weight of the recent tragedies. "How kind of you to call," Mrs. Elwood murmured, her voice brittle. "It's been rather dreadful." Miss Marple's soft voice was full of understanding as she replied, "I thought a bit of jam might cheer you. And Mr. Clement when he's back on his feet, how is he faring?" The relief in Mrs. Elwood's voice as she spoke of Miss Clement's recovery was palpable, but it was quickly overshadowed by her whispered confession of guilt. "They all think I did it, don't they? First Hargreaves, now this." Miss Marple gave a gentle smile, her eyes drifting to the tea tray. There she noticed the familiar sight of the chipped teacup. Another link in a chain she was determined to follow. "You locked the shed after the inspector searched it, didn't you?" she asked, her tone calm yet probing. Mrs. Elwood nodded, her fingers fidgeting with her handkerchief. But the doubts lingered, deepened by the memory of the other teacups. The set that had once been Mr. Hargreaves' favorite. "Curious, isn't it?" Miss Marple murmured, her eyes now sharper, a spark of realization igniting, almost as if someone wanted them noticed. Before Mrs. Elwood could respond, a shadow passed the window, and Miss Marple's gaze followed it, sharp as ever. It was Mrs. Lucy Dane, clutching her handbag with a nervous urgency. An idea began to take root in Miss Marple's mind, one that would soon lead her to the shop where Mrs. Dane worked. The postmistress was behind the counter, sorting letters. But the moment Miss Marple entered, her demeanor shifted. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice strained. "What brings you back?" Miss Marple, unfazed, set her basket down with a soft clink, her eyes studying the woman carefully. "Oh, just a little errand," she replied casually. "And a bit of news. Mr. Clement's improving, I hear. Such a relief, though, I wonder. 2 poisonings, both with tea. Almost like a pattern, don't you think?" Mrs. Dane froze, her hand faltering as a letter slipped from her fingers. She echoed, her voice sharp, almost too defensive. "I wouldn't know. It's all so awful. Awful indeed," Miss Marple agreed, her voice smooth as ever. "Though it's the little things that catch my eye, like that saucer missing from Mr. Hargreaves' cup. I suppose it might have been dropped or picked up by someone who didn't realize you were near the vicarage that day, helping with the fete." Mrs. Dane's eyes widened, and her fingers clenched around the letter, as if trying to anchor herself. "I was in the tent most of the time," she stammered, her voice trembling, "fetching scones, running errands. I didn't see anything." Miss Marple smiled, her expression calm and unruffled. "Of course not," she said, her words almost an afterthought. But in her mind, the pieces were clicking together, and with every passing moment, she felt herself drawing closer to the truth. The village's dark secrets were unspooling, and the final thread was within reach. Miss Jane Marple sat in her cozy parlor, the fire crackling softly in the hearth, a delicate china teacup resting on the small table beside her. The wool of her knitting was as soft as the thoughts in her mind, but beneath her calm exterior, her mind was whirring. The mystery of the twin poisonings had taken a more intricate turn, one that had perplexed even the sharpest minds in the village. The teacups, chipped and seemingly insignificant, had become the thread she would follow to uncover the truth. Mrs. Elwood, once an easy target for suspicion, still held some mysteries, but the strange attack on Mr. Clement, and the odd details surrounding the poisonings, suggested a more calculated hand at work. Her thoughts sharpened as she rose from her chair, and gathered her things, her steady movements betraying no sign of the tension that had been building. She left her cottage with purpose, a small basket of homemade preserves tucked under her arm as a pretext. The door to the Elwood house creaked as she entered, Mrs. Elwood appearing at once both relieved and wary to see her. Her eyes, still red from sleepless nights, betrayed the fear she had of being suspected, but Miss Marple's soothing voice put her slightly at ease. "I thought you might enjoy some fresh jam, just to brighten the day," she offered gently. Mrs. Elwood took the basket with a grateful smile, but there was a fragility to her composure, as if the weight of the suspicion that had been cast upon her could crack her like fine porcelain. "Thank you, Miss Marple. Things have been unbearable," she sighed, her voice wavering. "Mr. Clement is improving, but his confusion about the events, his constant muttering about the tea, it makes me feel like I'm living in a nightmare." Miss Marple, always observant, nodded slowly, her gaze flicking to the teapot on the sideboard. 2 cups sat there, one with a chipped rim, the other slightly askew, as if they had been hastily placed. "It's curious," Miss Marple remarked with a soft smile, "how so many chipped teacups seem to keep turning up." Mrs. Elwood blinked, her gaze darting toward the cups before she hurriedly said, "They were Mr. Hargreaves' favorite, you know. He always insisted on the same one. Said it reminded him of home. I tried to keep them for the fete. But after," her voice trailed off, too burdened with meaning to continue. "Ah yes, after," Miss Marple murmured, her expression unreadable. "But I wonder," almost as if someone wants these particular cups noticed, she mused, watching Mrs. Elwood's reaction closely. A shadow passed by the window then, quick and purposeful. Miss Marple's gaze followed, and an idea stirred in her mind like a breath of fresh air. She rose, smoothing her skirt with practiced elegance. "I mustn't keep you, Beatrice. Do pass on my best to Mr. Clement," she said softly, her tone still gentle but laden with the weight of a hidden understanding. Her next stop was the village shop, where Mrs. Dane was busy sorting through letters behind the counter. As the door swung open, Mrs. Dane looked up, her expression stiffening. "Miss Marple," she greeted curtly, her hands tightening around the letters she was holding. "It's been a while. What brings you here today?" "Oh, just a small errand," Miss Marple replied, her voice light but with an edge of sharpness beneath the surface. "And some news. I hear Mr. Clement is recovering. Such a relief. Though I can't help but wonder. 2 poisonings. Both involving tea. Almost like a pattern, don't you think?" Mrs. Dane froze for a moment, the air thick with tension as the words hit harder than expected. "A pattern," she echoed, her voice cracking just slightly. "I wouldn't know about that." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled ever so faintly as she pressed on, setting her basket on the counter. "The little things do catch my attention, you know. Like the missing saucer from Mr. Hargreaves' teacup. I suppose it might have been dropped somewhere, or perhaps picked up by someone who didn't realize you were near the vicarage that day, running errands for the fete." Mrs. Dane's hands tightened around the letter, her face blanching. "I was in the tent most of the time," she stammered, her voice uneven. "Fetching scones. Running errands. I didn't see anything." "Of course," Miss Marple said with a soft understanding smile, though her mind was already piecing together the clues. She left the shop, her heart steady, but her mind racing. Mrs. Dane's reaction, that flash of panic, spoke volumes. She had been near the vicarage wall, where the teacups had been scattered, and her defensive posture had confirmed the suspicion Miss Marple had been building. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple resumed her knitting, the rhythm of the needles slow and methodical, as she replayed the encounters in her mind. The truth was drawing nearer, and she was prepared to pull it into the light. The web of deception was fraying, and she would watch for one more careless move. Her hunch had always been right. The killer was growing bolder. The pieces were falling into place, and soon the mystery would be solved. Miss Marple sipped her tea, the quiet of the afternoon settling around her like a cloak, and waited for the final reveal. Miss Marple's gaze never wavered, as she leaned back slightly in her chair, a soft smile curving her lips, though her words cut through the air with sharp precision. "It's curious, isn't it, how some things stick with you? Like that moment with Mrs. Dane by the wall. Flustered, perhaps she lost something, or perhaps something was taken from her." Tommy Pierce's casual observation seemed to hang in the air for a moment, his words like a casual probe. And yet Miss Marple saw it. The subtle panic in Mrs. Dane's eyes, her quick shift in demeanor, too telling to be ignored. The post-mistress had recoiled quickly, snapping back with feigned innocence, brushing away the insinuation with such force that Miss Marple's suspicions grew sharper. She hadn't denied anything outright, only deflected. The slip was tiny, almost imperceptible, but in Miss Marple's mind, it was enough to set her resolve. That slight flinch, the stumble in her speech, revealed much more than Mrs. Dane might have intended. What had Mrs. Dane been so eager to hide? And then there was the matter of the teacups, the chipped ones. The ones Mrs. Dane had avoided mentioning when she'd been so involved in the tea arrangements at the village fete. The cyanide poison, so expertly hidden in the innocent guise of a familiar beverage. Back in her cottage, Miss Marple sat still, knitting in hand, though her thoughts raced. The pieces were coming together, slow but deliberate, like the pieces of a complex puzzle that had to be examined from every angle. Mrs. Dane was hiding something. Perhaps it was not just a grudge against Mr. Hargreaves, but something far deeper. The past always finds a way of resurfacing after all. And Mrs. Dane had been close enough to him to know things, secrets, debts, a betrayal that might have cost her much more than money. It was her nervousness, the way she'd turned pale at even the mention of his name, that spoke volumes. Miss Marple had known she would have to push, just a little, before the truth would come spilling out. And so a plan was set, simple in its execution, but layered in subtlety. The next day, Miss Marple made the call. Her voice was soft and unassuming, as always, but there was something to it that made both Dolly Bantry and Inspector Craddock pause when they heard it. "Just a little chat about something I've noticed," Miss Marple had said. It might help. Dolly had arrived first, full of energy, as ever, while Inspector Craddock had trailed behind, the weight of his failure hanging heavy in his shoulders. Miss Marple had poured the tea with practiced ease, her movements slow and deliberate as she set the stage. Her tone was mild, but her words were sharp, cutting into the mystery without breaking a sweat. "The teacups, you see," Miss Marple began. "Mr. Hargreaves always insisted on that chipped set. And yet when he died, the saucer was gone. Not lost, not misplaced, but gone. And then Mr. Clement, poisoned in exactly the same way, with another chipped cup. And yet the saucer again was never mentioned." Dolly had leaned in, intrigued. "You think someone took it?" she asked, her voice betraying a hint of awe. Miss Marple nodded, a small smile playing at the corners of her lips. "I do. I believe it was Mrs. Lucy Dane." Inspector Craddock, ever skeptical, raised an eyebrow. "The postmistress?" he asked, clearly unconvinced. "What would she have to do with it?" Miss Marple's eyes softened as she continued, her voice gentle but unwavering. "You see, Mrs. Dane knew Mr. Hargreaves before he came to St. Mary May. He came here to escape a scandal, money gone missing, enemies hot on his heels. As the postmistress, she handled his letters, those thick envelopes from the city, threatening perhaps or demanding. She saw him at his worst, and at the fete when his name came up. I saw it, her nervousness. Tommy Pierce too, saw her near the vicarage wall, near the shed. And she was flustered. Yes, but there was something else, something hidden in that moment." Craddock, now beginning to see the faintest glimmer of truth, tried to refocus on the evidence. "But the poison was in the shed, not the tea." Miss Marple shook her head, her voice calm, almost soothing. "Yes, but the shed was accessible to many, if one knew where to look." Mrs. Dane helped with the tea tent. She could have slipped cyanide into Mr. Hargreaves' cup, without anyone noticing. And the saucer, she took it to hide her involvement. You see, she hated him. Perhaps he betrayed her, once, maybe a debt left unpaid. She had reason to wait for her moment, and the opportunity came when he made his tea his habit. Dolly's eyes widened as realization hit. "But Mr. Clement," she gasped. "A clever ruse," Miss Marple replied softly. Once suspicion fell on Mrs. Elwood, Mrs. Dane saw a chance to deflect attention. She poisoned Mr. Clement, making it look like an outsider's work. She used the same technique, leaving another chipped cup to tie it back to Hargreaves, all the while knowing she had pushed suspicion far from herself. But she overplayed her hand. The missing saucer, her nerves betrayed her. Craddock, though still skeptical, scribbled furiously in his notebook. "That's a stretch, Miss Marple," he muttered. "No proof, just guesses." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled as she leaned forward. "Not guesses, Inspector. I spoke to her yesterday." She flinched when I mentioned the saucer and the wall. She stumbled over her words. "If you search her cottage behind the counter or in her handbag, you might find it. A chipped saucer, tea stains on it, and perhaps even a letter, one that ties her to Mr. Hargreaves' past." A heavy silence settled over the room, thick with tension. Cradock stared at her for a long moment, then snapped his notebook shut. "I'll look into it," he said, gruffly, rising. "If you're right, I'll eat my hat." Dolly clapped her hands delighted. "Jane, you're a marvel." Miss Marple simply smiled, pouring herself another cup of tea. Later that evening, the results of the search came through. Mrs. Dane's cottage had yielded the saucer, hidden away in a drawer, along with a crumpled letter in Mr. Hargreaves' handwriting, demanding her silence regarding an old betrayal. Faced with the evidence, Mrs. Dane had broken down, confessing to both murders in a flood of bitter, tearful remorse. The village buzzed with the news, but Miss Marple remained calm, knitting by her window as she reflected on the quiet satisfaction of having unraveled the truth. The Teacups had told their story, and Miss Marple had listened, patiently, until the final, undeniable pieces fell into place. The arrest of Mrs. Lucy Dane had sent a ripple through St. Mary Me, a shockwave of revelation and the unmistakable hum of realization that stirred the village in ways none could have expected. "I always thought she had a peculiar air about her," Mrs. Price remarked softly, standing by the counter in the village shop, while Colonel Bantry grumbled to himself about never fully trusting quiet types, those who were too calm, too controlled. But despite their musings, the truth delivered with a gentle precision only Miss Jane Marple could muster, had brought clarity. Yet the clarity left an uneasy weight, as though the village had exhaled but remained on edge, its breath still held in some unseen, lingering way. Miss Marple, ever the observer, sat in her garden, her shawl draped carefully over her shoulders to ward off the morning chill. Her knitting needles clicked in a soft rhythmic pattern as she worked on a scarf, the pale blue yarn weaving through her fingers, with the same practiced grace she applied to unraveling mysteries. The roses in her garden swayed lightly in the breeze, their bright petals offering a soft contrast to the somber stone of the wall that framed them. Despite the stillness, she knew the village would recover in time. After all, it always did. Yet as she glanced up from her work, a faint ripple of unease in the air reminded her that the scars of suspicion would take longer to fade. Dolly Bantry arrived shortly after, her step light and buoyant compared to recent days, a basket of freshly baked scones in hand. "Jane, you're the talk of the town," Dolly declared, settling herself on the bench beside her, her voice tinged with a mix of admiration and curiosity. "Cradock, still red-faced, insists he would have figured it out eventually. I told him, though he'd be chasing Mrs. Elwood to the ends of the earth without you." "How did you know it was Mrs. Dane?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled with the soft wisdom of one who knew the world well, who had seen its patterns, its telltale signs. "It's always the little things, Dolly," she replied, her voice calm, yet firm with conviction. "The missing saucer, for instance. It didn't make sense unless someone took it. And then there were her nerves. The way she flinched when I mentioned it. People can't hide what they know. Not truly. They always betray themselves." Dolly shook her head in awe. To think, she'd been nursing that grudge for years, following Hargreaves here, plotting her revenge. Cradock says she admitted it all. Some business in London, years back. Hargreaves swindled her savings and left her destitute. She tracked him down, secured a job as the postmistress to keep an eye on him, and when the fate came, she saw her chance. "Revenge is patient," Miss Marple mused softly, her needles pausing for a brief moment as she reflected on the depths of human emotion. "It waits, and when it strikes with precision." The puzzle had come together in Miss Marple's mind long ago. The teacups, the missing saucer, the poisoned tea. Mrs. Dane had seen an opportunity in Hargreaves' meticulous habits. The poisoned tea, the deliberate link to Mrs. Elwood. It was all part of a careful ruse, a carefully spun web designed to implicate the wrong person. But she hadn't counted on the sharp eyes of the village, or on Miss Marple's quiet scrutiny. Dolly shivered at the thought of it all. Poor Mr. Clement. He's recovering though. He's weak as a kitten, but Beatrice is fussing over him like a mother hen. She says she'll never look at a teacup the same way again. Miss Marple chuckled quietly. her voice a soft rustle like the wind through the trees. "I dare say she won't, but they'll be all right, the pair of them. St. Mary Me has a way of healing itself." They sat in silence for a time. The village life swirling around them. Children's laughter echoed in the distance. A dog barked in the lane, and the church bells rang the hour. Life, despite the dark undertones that had briefly overtaken it, carried on. But beneath the ordinary sounds, there was still an undercurrent of something unsettling, a lingering memory of poison in the roses, of secrets carried in the letters hidden in the post. Later that afternoon, Inspector Crack made an unexpected visit. He stood at the gate, his hat in hand, and his posture stiff but respectful. "Miss Marple," he said, clearing his throat. "I owe you an apology. Mrs. Dane's confession. It's all true. I can't say I enjoy being outdone. But I'm grateful. You've solved what I couldn't." Miss Marple smiled softly, her tone gentle as ever. "No need for apologies, Inspector. You would have gotten there eventually. I merely gave a little nudge in the right direction." Crack gave a wry smile, tipping his hat in acknowledgement. "A nudge indeed. I'll remember that next time. Good day, Miss Marple." As he left, Miss Marple turned her gaze toward the horizon, the sun dipping behind the hills in a peaceful, serene glow. She thought of Hargreaves, a man undone by his past, of the quiet vengeance that had shaped the course of so many lives. The truth had been revealed, but the shadows it cast would linger in the hearts of those who had lived through it. The air in Elmridge Hollow carried a deceptive calm on the morning that Eleanor March received the letter, a thin, aged envelope nestled between bills and a gardening catalogue, bearing a faded London postmark and handwriting that trembled with urgency. Eleanor, known for her quiet walks and sharper mind, felt something shift the moment her fingers touched it. It was signed by a name she'd never heard, Matilda Gracewell, but the words inside chilled her more than she expected. "He's there among you, Eleanor," the letter began. "James Fairborn, he calls himself Mr. Blythe now, is no stranger. He ruined lives in the city, mine included. I write not for revenge, but to prevent others from falling under his charm. Watch him. He smiles too easily." As Eleanor sat back in her chair, the morning sunlight fractured across her parlor, illuminating dust motes that danced like forgotten memories. She knew Mr. Blythe, the gentleman with the cane, the warm chuckle, and the way he always seemed to know just a bit more than he should. It wasn't long before she began noticing things she'd missed. A whispered argument behind the greengrocer's, a woman who left town quietly after spending time at the vicarage, and a ledger at the Women's Cooperative Fund that didn't quite add up. But it was the child, Lily Tamsin, who said the most revealing thing of all. "Mr. Blythe says secrets are like keys, Miss Eleanor. He collects them." That night, Eleanor climbed into the attic and retrieved her father's old journals. He'd once served in the city's legal circuit, and she scoured names trying to match the elegant lies of Mr. Blythe to the records of Fairborn's betrayal. Her suspicions solidified when she traced a series of vanished inheritances all tied to a solicitor's firm dissolved quietly 10 years prior. The next morning, she approached Inspector Veal, under the guise of delivering rhubarb tarts, and together they laid a plan that drew upon the keen eyes of the village. The librarian, who knew who borrowed what, the baker who noticed tremors in a hand, the children who spied through hedges. As truth unspooled like a skein of wool, a darker picture emerged. Mr. Blythe had orchestrated a lifetime of careful thefts, masking cruelty in kindness, and when confronted, he offered Eleanor a single hollow smile. "I always admired your clarity," he said before they took him away. Later, with the village in a hush of disbelief and gratitude, Eleanor walked to the edge of the lake, where the willows hung heavy, and let Matilda's letter drift onto the water, watching it ripple outward. Though justice had come, the scars remained etched in ledgers, whispered in parlors, and remembered in Eleanor's eyes, which now saw everything a shade sharper. Elmridge Hollow returned to its gentle rhythms. Tea under verandas, children skipping stones, neighbors nodding, but beneath it all lingered the certainty that even the quietest places carry secrets, and sometimes it takes a single voice from the past to rouse the watchful heart of a village. The petals of spring had only just begun to settle across the village when Miss Edith Rowley received the letter, a folded relic wrapped in silence and dust, bearing the unmistakable tension of something long unsaid. It was an odd thing, this letter, a messenger from the past that had been far too long in the making, as if it had traveled through the layers of time itself to reach her. She found it nestled among her usual correspondence, innocuous bills and polite notes from neighbors. But this one was different, postmarked from London, unsigned, its ink smudged, and the paper strangely warm, as if it had been passed through too many hands before it found its way to her doorstep. It had arrived quietly, almost unnoticed, but now, it felt as if the whole of her world had shifted the moment she saw it. She read it once, then again, the name Anthony Keller, surfacing from beneath the tide of her memory, like a ghost returning with unfinished business. He had once lived among them, charming and polished, the type who knew exactly when to smile, and exactly what to conceal, the banker who had seemed to glide through life effortlessly, with just the right words for every occasion, and the right connections to cover any indiscretions. But now, his name was like a shadow, a reminder of all the things left unsaid, the layers of lies and deceit that had surrounded him. He had been a man of wealth and influence, a gentleman by outward appearances, but there had always been an edge to him, something distant and calculating behind those perfect smiles. He was a conman, his schemes intricately woven into the very fabric of the village, a quiet manipulator, who had left nothing but devastation in his wake before vanishing without a trace. His disappearance had been so clean, so smooth, that the village had almost forgotten him. Almost. But now, with this letter in hand, Edith could feel the threads of the past tightening once more, the old buried resentment rising to the surface. The letter, penned by a woman named Lavinia Gray, hinted at betrayal, at embezzled funds, shattered promises, and broken lives, but it also spoke of something darker, something far more sinister. It was not just a letter of explanation, but a veiled warning that Keller's end had not been the accident the newspapers had reported, but a reckoning long overdue. There had been a hand behind it, a shadow in the dark, and Lavinia had been part of it, or perhaps a witness to it all. It was a confession wrapped in the form of a warning, a final attempt to clear the air, or perhaps to absolve herself. Edith folded the letter carefully, her fingers brushing the edge of the paper, and stepped into the garden, the weight of the words pressing down on her chest. Her mind raced as her gaze fell upon the flowers, the roses blooming in a defiant burst of color, the thorny stems reaching towards the sky, like silent sentinels, guarding the secrets of the past. It was there, amidst the fragrance of the blooms, that she found Mrs. Dallow, pruning the roses with an uncharacteristic fervor. The shears snipped a bit too close, a bit too hard, and Edith could see the strain in her movements, the way her hands shook ever so slightly. It was then that Edith, driven by an instinct she could not explain, mentioned the name Lavinia. The effect was immediate. Mrs. Dallow's hand froze mid-air, the shears suspended, as if the mere mention of that name had struck her like a physical blow. The air between them thickened with something unspoken, something old and unresolved. Mrs. Dallow's voice was brittle when she finally spoke, her words sharp and clipped. "He deserved whatever he got," she muttered, her eyes not meeting Edith's, her face unreadable. Edith's breath caught in her throat, her heart pounding. Could she have known? Could others have known about the depths of Keller's darkness? Could this village, with its idyllic cottages and smiling faces, have been hiding its own secrets all this time? The village had mourned Keller's death, but it had been a distant, formal kind of mourning, a politeness wrapped in the stiff, forced smiles of people who had learned to turn a blind eye to the things they could not control. But Edith knew better. There had been no true grief for him here. There had only been quiet relief, the kind that comes when a storm finally passes. But this letter, these words, it was as if the storm had only been momentarily halted, waiting for the right wind to stir it up again. That evening, as Edith sat by her window, the letter beside her teacup, Her thoughts were a swirl of confusion and clarity. Lavinia's words weren't just a warning. They were a confession, a whispered admission of guilt and regret, a veiled acknowledgement of the role she and others had played in Keller's demise. But it was more than that. It was an offering, too. A final plea for understanding. Lavinia had been caught in the web of Keller's manipulations, perhaps even as a victim herself. And now, with his death, she was trying to make sense of the chaos he had left behind. But Edith knew something else as well. The past, no matter how well hidden, never truly dies. It lingers in the quiet corners of our minds, in the things we can never quite forget. And in this village, the past was not just a shadow. It was a presence. It lived in the roses and the teacups, in the faint scent of perfume that lingered long after the person had gone. It haunted every corner, every whispered conversation, every sideways glance. The constable had no need to be involved. The case had been closed long ago, and what was left now was only a murky pool of suspicion and regret. The grave had its secrets, and some things were better left buried. But Edith couldn't let go. Not entirely. She couldn't bring herself to accuse, to stir the pot further. Instead, she would write back to Lavinia, to the woman whose hands had trembled with the weight of what she knew, to the woman whose name now rested in Edith's hands like a delicate, fragile thing. She would offer her acknowledgement, her understanding. The justice that had come had been quiet, creeping, a slow march of retribution that had arrived without fanfare, without the drama of a courtroom or the closure of a police report. It had been something more subtle, more dangerous, a reckoning that had settled into the soil of the village, like an old wound that would never truly heal. In the end, Edith knew, the past never truly leaves us. It lingers, like dust in the corners, like the faintest echo of a long-forgotten song. And as she sealed the letter, and set it aside to be posted, she understood something profound, that the past in all its complexity and darkness could never be erased. It would live on, in the roses, in the whispers, and in the silence between words. As the final rays of evening sunlight spilled like golden syrup across the cobbled lanes of Elderwick Hollow, Miss Cressida Thornley sat amidst the soft clink of teaspoons and murmurs of polite conversation, her smile gracious, but her mind adrift, tethered not to parish gossip or garden fetes, but to the faint echo of a name, Elias Crowhurst. It had begun, as these things often do, with something seemingly trivial, an unsigned envelope tucked discreetly between hymn sheets at St. Bartholomew's, the handwriting neat but unfamiliar, and the message inside brief, almost surgical. He remembers. 3 words, but enough to unsettle a woman who had built her life around forgetting. Elias, once the village's prized historian, had vanished 20 years ago, under a cloud of scandal involving missing archives, a dead archivist, and an entire ledger that never surfaced. It had been ruled a misadventure, boating accident, the papers claimed. But those who remembered Elias's last lecture, with its cryptic warnings about secrets buried deeper than bones, were less convinced. Now, all these years later, the letter had reignited a spark Cressida thought long extinguished. That evening, as the women discussed jam stalls and the vicar lamented the cost of choir robes, she caught Mrs. Netherby pausing mid-sentence when Elias's name passed her lips, the teacup in her hand trembling just slightly before resuming its path to her mouth. The moment was brief, but it changed something. Later, alone in her drawing room, the letter resting against the delicate lace doily, like a loaded whisper, Cressida recalled how Elias had once shown her a fragment of parchment that hinted at a betrayal reaching back generations, a map not of land, but of lives, carefully plotted, devastatingly true. The next morning, she returned to the church crypt, where the light was thinner, and the air cool with reverence, and there she found it, a second letter, hidden behind the choir's storage chest, sealed with red wax and marked only with the initials EC. This one spoke not of vengeance, but of penance, of a truth too dangerous to live with, and too cruel to bury. And though Cressida read it with calm precision, her heart thudded like thunder in a silent cathedral. She never spoke of it, not to the constable, nor to her friends, but that Sunday, during tea at the vicarage, She lifted her cup with a still hand, and met Mrs. Netherby's gaze with quiet understanding. "A lovely set," she remarked of the new china. Her voice light, but her eyes sharp as glass. "Much better than the old one. Too many cracks." Mrs. Netherby nodded, her smile tight. "Yes, well, best not to keep broken things around." Outside, Elderwick Hollow carried on, the scent of lilacs rising as children played, and a church bell rang faintly in the distance. But inside Cressida's cottage, beneath the floorboards in a box once meant for sugar biscuits, lay 2 letters, 1 map, and a truth that would never see daylight again. Some mysteries, she understood now, weren't solved. They were simply managed.